first visited Canada about 12 years ago at the invitation of a friend of mine, the Grand Chief out of British Columbia, who introduced me to the Métis settlements of Alberta back in probably 2014. And at the time I was working with a different company, and we were interested in helping some of my friends' people to develop opportunities for economic development in their traditional lands. And in the case of the Métis settlements, they're the land that they own. Western settlements, there are 8 in total, but the 4 that I've spent most time with are based in, called the Western settlements, are quite heavily forested. They traditionally used to have quite a lot of activity surrounding forestry. They live a certain lifestyle which involves trapping and hunting, and they're fairly remote from the major population centres of Calgary and Edmonton in Alberta. Probably around, but the settlement I'm probably going to talk most about now is located in winter, could be a good 8-9 hour drive from the airport in Edmonton, which I fly into when I visit. The Western settlements are different because they, as I said, they're very focused on forestry. But unfortunately, over the last decade or two, for all kinds of reasons, generally economic, they've not been particularly active in managing their forestry or generating employment or income from their timberland. Well, back in 2014, we started working on a plan to help them to actually develop something that would give them a long-term, sustainable and environmentally focused way to manage and maintain their forests, whilst at the same time, supporting their communities, which are really quite small. Our focus as a business is to support in an environmentally sustainable way the activities of Indigenous people in the areas in which they traditionally have lived, and wherever possible, helping them to understand how they might integrate with existing businesses or funding sources to be able to build for themselves opportunities that alone they may not manage to create. Forestry in Canada is a big deal. It employs 250,000 people. It's a multi-billion-dollar revenue stream for the country. It's important in more ways than simply economic, from the economic perspective, in so much as, as you may have, I'm sure you have, been reading in Australia or in California, and the same in Canada, there are ever more regular wildfire incidents going on nowadays with climate change and global warming. And forestry management is something that certainly where there's human habitation is really important, and particularly if, like our partners do, you live inside of the forest itself. Last year, as a case in point, there was a very serious wildfire which took place around High Level, Alberta, which is about 72 kilometres north of Paddle Prairie Métis settlement, where we're about to position our first project. And that fire burned for months. There were over 10,000 people evacuated. Nobody, fortunately, as far as I'm aware, was killed. And the fire burned as far as Paddle Prairie Métis settlement. The fire doesn't respect the boundary. Okay. And a number of homes were destroyed, 15 in total. And around 40 or 50% of their forestry was damaged or destroyed. And that's the reason why, the forestry management is so important. Typically, that would be that. People would pick up the pieces, rebuild their homes or move on. I mean, they can't move on because the Métis live on their settlement. So those homes are being rebuilt. And people would do their best to avoid a fire happening again. Perhaps clear areas around their homes or and such like. But there would be no use for that fibre, certainly 1 year or so after the fire had passed. So typically what happens once a fire has affected a forest, but if it's under management by a forestry company or a number of tenure holders, is they'll do their very best right after that fire to go in, inspect it, the forestry, and decide what can be salvaged. And that typically goes on within the first 12 months of a fire passing through a forestry area. And after that, it's likely that the timber that's still standing is not usable by industry, by traditional industry in the downstream forestry production areas. So it's left to stand simply because it costs money to remove this forestry. So unfortunately, until now, that's been the way of the world. So if you look at another big fire in Alberta from 2016 was what was called the Beast out of around Fort McMurray, Alberta. It was bigger than the Chuckhead Creek wildfire, probably 50 or 60% larger. And to this day, very many hundreds of thousands of hectares of forestry are still standing as trees that were burned that day back in 16 and have not been touched. And the reason for that is that it costs money to cut, to remediate and to reforest, and there's no offtake for that fibre in the condition it's left in by the fire. And it's simply a question of technology advancement. It's also due to the fact that the world has changed. People are becoming acutely aware of the fact that there is something called climate change. There is something called global warming. It's no longer just weather. And the technology that we, RMDE, bought the license to allows us to treat this type of timber, very low quality fibre. Not only this, I'll give you in Alberta and other parts of the world, but we operate in Alberta, so I'll focus on that. 5 or 6 million tons of forestry residuals are burned in place each year, by which I mean they'll cut down a tree, take the piece of the tree that they need for the sawmill or the board mill or to make a product that you'd recognise, and the balance of that tree is piled up, and at some point in the near future, normally in winter time, in a controlled way to avoid forest fires, what will happen is it will be set fire to and it will burn, and that will generate smoke and microparticulates and pollutants and greenhouse gases, obviously. None of the forestry companies wants to do this. The only reason they have to do it is because they have had no other alternatives. So what we're doing is we're moving into, with our new technologies and new thinking, and with new investment partners, we're able who are very focused on environmental solutions. We're able to change the way that those types of fibre are used, whether it's fire damaged, whether it's this slash that gets burnt on the ground, or whether it's wood that's been damaged by insects or disease. What we do makes them usable. There's 3 parts to what we do. One part is abatement. Rather than those piles of slash being burnt and emitting into the atmosphere, we take them and produce something from them that ties up those greenhouse gases in a physical product so that they don't, whether it be through decomposition or through burning, they don't emit greenhouse gases. Second thing that we do is we capture carbon. And the way that we capture carbon is by producing a product so that even if the product were not used, that product would hold the greenhouse gases and stop them again reaching the atmosphere. And the third thing we do is carbon sequestration. And the way that we do that is by taking more carbon dioxide out of the air, because by reforesting the areas where we recover this fibre that otherwise would not have been recovered, thus creating significantly greater forested areas where we operate than otherwise would have been the case. If you don't cut those trees, as we said earlier, because they've been damaged by fire and there's no economic reason to do so, then generally they won't get reforested. So that's something that we're very happy to take care of. And certainly in the case of Paddle Prairie Métis settlement, it's so important that we remediate those forests, and that at some point in the future, those forests come back to where they were before the Chuckhead Creek wildfire. The wildlife returns, and that the people who live there can return to some level of normality. These forestry areas are not harvested. There are many negative effects. If it's just left to stand, first of all, it becomes in itself a fire hazard. So fire may beget more fire. And this particularly is important where people are living. So on Paddle Prairie Métis settlement, people live there. They've experienced this fire. They lost homes. They were evacuated. They don't want to go through this again. They've lost a lot of wildlife. It's very upsetting for the people living there, and they want this return to how it was before the fire, and that's what we aim to do. But another thing that's really, really important is that these fires are vast, and so the amount of smoke alone from the fire itself is bad enough. But if you take on top of that these forests will be left to stand, to decay and decompose, and to emit methane and other greenhouse gases for many, many years to come. They don't decompose in 1 year. They could be there for 10, 15, longer years. And this is all adding to the emissions of greenhouse gases. So to be able to take that away at a reasonably early stage, process it into something useful, particularly where that product, as in our case, will then go on not only to have provided those benefits, but also to replace fossil fuels being burnt elsewhere, for example, or as soil amendments, improving the environment in that place or in other places, then we can avoid some of these negatives. First of all, the trees that we utilize are dead. They are no longer a forest. There'll be people who argue and say that, well, it's part of nature, and that forest fires left unchecked by man for millions of years have created what we have today on planet Earth, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, the situation today is very different. So our focus is on removing what would otherwise not be used and replacing it with trees that, for now and for the next, until maturity, will be absorbing carbon dioxide. So there'll be carbon sinking or sequestering carbon. Not only that, they'll be growing into strong, healthy trees. They'll be providing habitat for wildlife, and there'll be an economic value at the end of that, which there would not be otherwise were we not to be there.